In March of 1847, in the rural township of Harrow's End, Pennsylvania, a drought revealed what 3 generations of rainfall had mercifully concealed. When the Conestoga Creek receded to levels not seen since the settlement's founding, it exposed the northwestern corner of the Wickham family farm, 23 acres that had, for 42 years, produced the most abundant wheat harvests in Lancaster County. What the cracked earth revealed was that springs were not rocks or clay deposits, but bones. Human bones, in quantities that defied immediate counting. The initial survey, conducted by County Coroner Dr. Ephraim Walsh over 6 days in April, cataloged the remains of no fewer than 78 individuals. Subsequent excavations would raise that number to 147 confirmed victims, with evidence suggesting dozens more had been completely consumed by the soil's chemistry and time's passage. The victims ranged in age from 4 years to approximately 60. Most were between 15 and 35 years of age. All had been buried in a systematic grid pattern, spaced exactly 4 feet apart, extending in neat rows like the wheat that had grown above them. The arrangement was not haphazard. It was agricultural. Medical examination revealed something more disturbing than the deaths themselves. The bodies had been treated with compounds, sulfates, phosphates, and nitrates, designed to accelerate decomposition and nutrient release into the surrounding soil. They had been prepared, processed, fertilized into the earth with the same care a farmer might show his seed corn. The Wickham family patriarch, Silas Wickham, had died in his sleep just 3 months prior to the drought at the age of 89. His son, Matthias Wickham, 57, maintained the farm with his own 3 sons. All claimed complete ignorance of what lay beneath their fields. The county records pertaining to the full investigation were sealed by judicial order in 1851 and buried in the basement archives of the Lancaster County courthouse, where they remained untouched for 112 years. The files were marked with a single word: resolved. But the question that Dr. Walsh wrote in his private journal, a journal not discovered until 1963, was never truly answered. If the Wickhams did not know, then who planted the crops? And if they did know, what manner of harvest were they truly reaping? Before we continue with the disturbing truth of what happened in Harrow's End, if this story intrigues you, if you're drawn to the darkness that hides beneath American history's surface, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel. Not just for the algorithm, but because what we're about to uncover gets buried again and again. Stories like Silas Wickham's disappear into sealed archives and forgotten courthouse basements because they're uncomfortable, because they reveal things about our past that challenge the narratives we prefer to tell ourselves. Click that notification bell. This is only the beginning, and the revelations ahead require an audience willing to face them. And here's what I want to know. Tell us in the comments what state or city you're from, because as we'll discover, Harrow's End wasn't isolated. This happened somewhere near you, too. The question is whether anyone bothered to look beneath the soil. This channel is only for the bravest, for true mystery seekers who understand that the most terrifying monsters weren't the ones in folktales our ancestors told. They were the ones sitting across from them at Sunday dinner. Now, let's return to 1847, to a community about to discover it had been living atop a graveyard of its own making. Harrow's End in 1847 was not a town in the traditional sense. It was a farming township, a loose collection of 34 farmsteads scattered across rolling Pennsylvania countryside, bound together by a shared Quaker meeting house, a general store, a mill, and the unspoken understanding that survival required cooperation. The population numbered approximately 270 souls, though this figure fluctuated with the seasons. Farmhands came and went. Harvest workers appeared in August and vanished by October. Families struck by misfortune sold their land and moved west toward the Ohio territories. seeking fresh starts that Pennsylvania's established agricultural hierarchy could no longer provide them. Lancaster County in the 1840s was America's breadbasket. The limestone-rich soil produced wheat yields that fed Philadelphia's growing industrial population and filled the holds of merchant ships bound for European markets. A successful farm meant generational wealth. A failed farm meant destitution. The difference often came down to soil quality, and every farmer in the county knew it. The Wickham family had occupied their 260-acre holding since 1798, when Silas Wickham purchased the land from the Penn family's remaining colonial grant territories. Silas had been 29 years old then, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, a Quaker of impeccable standing, and a man known for his methodical approach to agriculture. Where other farmers treated their land with the casual brutality common to the era, exhausting soil, then moving on, Silas Wickham practiced what he called perpetual improvement. He kept detailed journals of crop rotation, rainfall, soil amendments. He experimented with composting techniques that neighbors found eccentric but effective. By 1810, the Wickham farm's wheat was grading higher at the Philadelphia Commodities Exchange than any other producer in the county. By 1820, Silas Wickham was wealthy, not merchant-class wealthy, but wealthy enough to matter. He served as township trustee. He extended credit to struggling neighbors. He donated generously to the meeting house. When the county debated whether to extend the turnpike through Harrow's End, it was Silas Wickham's endorsement that secured the project. His son, Matthias, born in 1790, inherited not just land but a reputation. The Wickham name meant reliability. It meant prosperity. It meant godliness without ostentation. The Quaker ideal made manifest in fertile fields and honest dealing. This reputation was the first reason the horror went undiscovered for so long. The second reason was more practical: isolation. Harrow's End sat 8 miles from the nearest incorporated town. The farms themselves spread across hills and hollows, separated by woodlots and creek bottoms. What happened on a man's property was his own business, and the Wickham's northwestern fields, the 23 acres that bordered the Conestoga Creek, were separated from the main farmstead by a dense stand of white oak and hickory that Silas had deliberately left uncleared. He called it his meditation woodland. He forbade hunting there. He walked its paths alone, often for hours, particularly in the spring and fall. Neighbors respected this eccentricity. The Quaker faith valued contemplation. And besides, a man who produced such abundant harvests was entitled to his peculiarities. The third reason was demographic. In an era before photography became commonplace, before systematic record-keeping extended beyond property deeds and births in family Bibles, people disappeared with disturbing regularity. Economic migrants, failed farmers, widows without family, indentured servants who fled their contracts, the mentally ill, criminals escaping Eastern courts, harvest workers, farmhands, peddlers, and itinerants of every description. The 1840s were a decade of movement. The canals had opened in the West. The railroads were coming. America was in motion, and Pennsylvania sat at the crossroads. A person might arrive in Harrow's End seeking work, stay a season, and vanish westward without anyone thinking twice about it. There were no missing persons bureaus, no systematic investigations. If a drifter didn't show up for Sunday's meeting, he'd obviously moved on. That was simply how the world worked. The Wickhams, in fact, were known for their Christian charity in hiring such people. Silas regularly employed men down on their luck, gave them work when other farmers wouldn't take the risk, fed them, housed them in the farm's bunkhouse, paid them fairly, or so the other workers said. Some stayed on for years. Most moved along eventually, following the restless pattern of landless men in a nation obsessed with westward expansion. No one thought to count how many of Silas Wickham's workers left in the night without collecting their final wages. No one thought to ask why the northwestern fields, the ones beyond the meditation woodland, always seemed to produce heavier yields than the rest of the farm, despite being farthest from the barn and the manure piles that fertilized the other acreage. No one thought to wonder about the work Silas did alone in those fields in the dark hours before dawn. Not until the drought came. Not until the earth itself confessed what 3 generations had refused to see. Silas Wickham's public persona was constructed with the same methodical care he applied to his agricultural practices. Every element reinforced the image of a man whose success came from godliness, hard work, and scientific farming methods that were simply ahead of their time. He published, "This detail is critical to understanding how the deception functioned." Between 1815 and 1843, Silas Wickham wrote 27 letters to the American Farmer magazine, detailing his composting techniques, his theories on soil chemistry, and his experiments with what he called organic supplementation. The agricultural community didn't just tolerate his methods, they celebrated them. His 1828 letter, On the Virtues of Properly Decomposed Matter in Wheat Cultivation, was reprinted in farming periodicals across 6 states. He was an expert, an innovator. When his fields produced 40 bushels per acre while his neighbors struggled to reach 25, it wasn't suspicious, it was educational. Farmers came to study his methods. Silas welcomed them, gave generous tour of his composting operations, his carefully managed woodlots, and his rotation schedules. He showed them everything except the northwestern fields. Those, he explained, were part of a long-term experiment that wasn't ready for observation. Professional courtesy dictated that visitors respect this boundary. And they did. The Wickham household itself projected precisely calculated normalcy. Silas married Hannah Prout in 1789, a union that produced 4 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Hannah ran the household accounts, managed the kitchen garden, and hosted the women's prayer circle every 3rd Thursday. She died in 1831 of pneumonia, mourned by the entire township. By all accounts, she had been a devoted wife and mother. Had Hannah known? This question haunted investigators in 1847. Her personal diary, recovered from the farmhouse, contained 18 years of entries detailing domestic life, whether observations, recipes, and spiritual reflections. There was no hint of horror in those pages, no coded confessions, no mysterious absences that aligned with the deaths. Either Hannah Wickham was complicit and disciplined enough to maintain a fraudulent diary for nearly 2 decades, or Silas had successfully hidden his activities from his own wife. Dr. Walsh, in his sealed report, concluded the latter was more likely. The farmhouse sits 700 yards from the northwestern boundary. The meditation woodland screens all visual access. Mrs. Wickham's mobility was limited by chronic rheumatism after 1820. The defendant had ample opportunity for unsupervised activity in the contested acreage. Matthias, the son who inherited the farm, presented his own form of camouflage. Where Silas had been studious and reserved, Matthias was gregarious. He served on the township road committee. He judged livestock at the county fair. He married Elizabeth Brenneman, daughter of the township's largest dairy farmer, in a wedding that united 2 of Harrow's End's most prosperous families. They produced 5 healthy children. Matthias attended meetings every Sunday without fail. In 1845, when a fever swept through the township and killed 7 children, it was Matthias Wickham who organized the relief effort, delivering food to quarantined families, arranging for Dr. Walsh to visit homesteads that couldn't pay his fees, personally digging 3 of the graves when the ground froze before the gravedigger could complete his work. This was the man who would later claim ignorance of 147 bodies buried in systematic rows on his own property. The unwitting enablers were crucial to the deception's longevity. 3 men, in particular, created a protective barrier around the Wickham's reputation. simply by doing their jobs with the limited tools and assumptions available to them. Thomas Brenneman owned the general store and served as informal postmaster. Every spring, Silas or Matthias would mention hiring new workers for the season. Brenneman would extend credit for their supplies, work clothes, tobacco, basic necessities, which the Wickhams always settled promptly. Some of these workers Brenneman met personally, others he never saw. "Mr. Wickham has enough credit for a dozen men," he later testified. "I never questioned it. His word was better than most men's collateral." Sheriff Jacob Yost, elected in 1842, maintained order across a jurisdiction of 4 townships covering nearly 200 square miles. He had no deputies, no budget for investigations. His primary responsibilities were serving court papers, collecting delinquent taxes, and managing the county jail in Lancaster. When itinerant workers disappeared, which happened throughout the county, not just in Harrow's End, there was no mechanism for investigation even if Yost had been inclined to pursue it. A farmhand quits without notice. Maybe he owes money, maybe he's fleeing a wife, maybe he just got restless, Yost told the court in 1848. "That's the American freedom of movement. I'm not a constable for vagrant laborers." Dr. Ephraim Walsh, the man who would eventually expose the horror, had himself been an enabler. His practice served 3 townships. He delivered 4 of Matthias's children. He treated Silas for gout and Hannah for her rheumatism. He'd attended Sundays, meeting in the same building where the Wickhams sat 3 rows ahead. In 1839, when a hired man from the Wickham farm came to Walsh complaining of a broken arm, Walsh set the bone and sent him back to work. The man's name was recorded in Walsh's ledger as J. Peterson, laborer. That man's skeletal remains would later be identified by the distinctive malunion of the left radius, a break that had healed at a 15-degree angle, exactly matching Walsh's clinical notes. Walsh had treated a man who would be murdered within months, had perhaps treated him shortly before his death, and hadn't noticed anything wrong. The warning signs were there, but they appeared only in hindsight and only if you were looking for a pattern. In 1834, a traveling preacher remarked to the meeting house congregation that he'd noticed an unusual number of graves marked "Unknown Traveler" in the township cemetery. 11 by his count, all from the past 20 years. Someone replied that this was the price of Christian charity. Harrow's End didn't let strangers die unburied, even if they had no names. The observation was praised as evidence of the community's godliness, then forgotten. In 1838, a neighboring farmer named Clyde Morrison mentioned to Brenneman that he'd seen Silas Wickham working the northwestern fields at 3 in the morning, visible only by lantern light. "Queer time to be plowing," Morrison had said. Brenneman shrugged. "Queer fellow, but he grows the best wheat in the county. Maybe that's his secret, working while the rest of us sleep." In 1841, a drifter named Samuel Worth told a tavern in Lancaster that he'd worked a month for the Wickhams and something was wrong about that place. He couldn't specify what, just a feeling. He'd left without collecting his final week's wages because he didn't want to spend another night in the farm's bunkhouse. The tavern patrons laughed at him. A month later, Worth was arrested for public drunkenness. His testimony, if it could be called that, was dismissed as the paranoia of an alcoholic. These fragments existed in isolation, scattered across years and sources, visible only when assembled deliberately, and no one had reason to assemble them. The Wickhams were pillars of the community. Until March 1847, when the drought dropped the creek level by 6 feet, and exposed a corner of the northwestern field where erosion had pulled back the topsoil like a blanket, until a boy hunting rabbits found something white protruding from the creek bank and realized it was a human skull, until the community's pillar became its nightmare. The boy's name was Thomas Morrison, age 12, son of the same Clyde Morrison who'd seen Silas Wickham working by lantern light 9 years earlier. Thomas was hunting along the Conestoga Creek on March 14, 1847, a Saturday morning, following rabbit tracks in the mud that the receding water had exposed. The drought had entered its 7th week. The winter of 1846–47 had brought historically low snowfall, and spring rains had failed to materialize. The creek, normally 15 feet wide and deep enough to require a bridge crossing, had narrowed to a channel you could wade across without wetting your knees. Its banks, typically underwater, now rose like earthen walls revealing 3 feet of striated soil and stone. Thomas saw the white object protruding from the bank where the water had undercut the soil. He later testified that his first thought was that it was a rock, limestone perhaps, which was common in the area. He was going to ignore it, but something about the shape troubled him. He climbed down the bank. He touched it. It moved slightly, loose in the surrounding earth. He pulled, gently at first, then harder. It came free with a sound he described as like a boot pulling out of thick mud. It was a skull, humans, missing its lower jaw. The eye sockets were packed with clay. Thomas dropped it, scrambled backward, fell into the shallow creek. Then ran, leaving the skull on the muddy bank where it had lain for decades, finally exposed to spring sunlight. He ran directly home, a quarter mile, and told his father, who did not at first believe him. 12-year-old boys had active imaginations. They mistook deer skulls for human remains. They exaggerated. Clyde Morrison was in the middle of morning chores and had no patience for hysteria, but Thomas was insistent, tearful. "It had teeth, Pa, human teeth. I saw them." Clyde Morrison set down his pitchfork and accompanied his son back to the creek. When he saw what Thomas had found, he sent the boy home and walked directly to the Brenneman farmstead, the nearest neighboring property. Together, Clyde Morrison and Thomas Brenneman went to fetch Dr. Walsh. This was the first escalation, the moment when a child's grim discovery became a community concern. Dr. Walsh arrived at the creek bank at approximately 11 o'clock that morning. He examined the skull in situ, noting details in the small leather journal he carried for patient observations. The skull was an adult, male, judging by the heavy brow ridge and mastoid processes. It had been in the ground for years. The bone was stained dark brown by soil tannins, and the surface showed the fine crackling characteristic of long burial. Several teeth remained in the upper jaw. There was no obvious trauma to the cranium. Walsh had seen human remains before. Rural doctors frequently assisted coroners, and Pennsylvania soil occasionally surrendered Revolutionary War dead or Native American burials. This alone wasn't necessarily sinister. Then Walsh examined where the skull had emerged. The undercut bank showed a clear stratum of disturbed soil, darker, looser earth that contrasted with the surrounding undisturbed clay. He could see something else in that dark soil. Another bone. Possibly a femur. "We need to excavate carefully," Walsh told the two farmers. "There may be more." They worked for 2 hours using hand trowels and their fingers, carefully removing soil from the bank face. By 1 o'clock, they'd uncovered a complete skeleton, articulated and lying in anatomical position. Whoever this person had been, they'd been buried deliberately, not scattered by natural forces. The body had been laid supine, arms at sides, approximately 4 feet below what had been the ground surface. The skeleton showed no signs of trauma, no broken bones, no marks suggesting violence. Just a body buried in an unmarked grave on the Wickham property. "Could be an old family plot," Brenneman suggested. "Before the township cemetery was established." Walsh didn't respond immediately. He was looking at the disturbed soil stratum. It extended in both directions along the creek bank, maintaining a consistent depth. And there, 6 feet to the north, another pale shape emerging from the dark earth. By nightfall, they'd found 3 more skeletons, all adults, all buried in the same manner at the same depth, spaced at regular intervals. This was the second escalation, the recognition that this was not a single burial, but something systematic. Clyde Morrison rode to Lancaster that night and reported the findings to Sheriff Yost. Yost arrived in Harrow's End the following morning, Sunday, accompanied by 2 county commissioners and the county coroner, a retired physician named Dr. Leonard Hess. Dr. Walsh met them at the creek site before Sunday's meeting. The resistance to believing the truth began immediately. "The Wickham family has been in this township for 50 years, Commissioner James Hartley said as he examined the exposed remains. "Silas Wickham was a godly man. There's an explanation for this that doesn't involve criminality." 5 bodies, Dr. Hess observed, crouching by the nearest skeleton, buried in a grid pattern, on Wickham property. "Old family cemetery," Hartley repeated, "or perhaps cholera victims. There was an outbreak in 32, bodies buried quickly away from the main settlement." "I was here in 32, Dr. Walsh said quietly. "We buried the cholera dead in the township cemetery with lime covers. I have records of every burial. These aren't in those records." Sheriff Yost stood at the creek bank, looking north toward the Wickham farmstead, invisible beyond the tree line. "We need to talk to Matthias." They found Matthias Wickham preparing for Sunday's meeting, his family dressed and waiting by their wagon. When told about the discovery, Matthias's reaction appeared genuinely shocked. He sat down heavily on his porch steps, face draining of color. "On our property, human remains. 5 skeletons," Yost confirmed. "In the northwestern section along the creek." "You know anything about them?" Matthias shook his head slowly. That was Father's experimental acreage. He didn't like anyone working those fields, did the planting and harvesting himself mostly. Said the soil composition was different there and needed special handling." "Your father never mentioned burials, family graves?" "Never, I swear it." Dr. Hess stepped forward. "Mr. Wickham, we need permission to excavate further. This may be more extensive than 5 individuals." Matthias looked up, confused. "How much more?" "That's what we need to determine." What followed was a week of excavation that transformed from investigation to horror with each shovel of earth removed. Dr. Walsh coordinated the effort, dividing the exposed creek bank into sections and working systematically northward. By Monday evening, they'd uncovered 8 more skeletons. By Wednesday, the count reached 22. The creek bank exposure represented only the southernmost edge of the burial ground, the portion where erosion had undermined the bank and exposed the dark, disturbed soil stratum. On Thursday, they began excavating inland from the creek, into the field itself. The wheat stubble from last year's harvest still stood in uneven rows. Walsh marked a grid with stakes and twine, creating 5-foot squares, and directed a team of volunteers to dig test trenches. The first inland trench, sunk 4 feet deep, uncovered 3 skeletons lying side by side. The second trench revealed 4 more. The third trench was where Dr. Walsh understood the true scope of what they'd discovered. The soil came away in chunks, damp and dark and heavy. Unusually dark for this area, the surrounding Lancaster County soil was typically lighter, more clay-like. This earth was black, rich with organic matter, the kind of soil that farmers prayed for. The kind of soil that produced the Wickham's legendary harvests. 4 feet down, the shovel struck bone. Then more bone. The trench contained 6 skeletons, but they weren't completely skeletonized. The leftmost body retained decomposed soft tissue, tendons still connecting joints, desiccated skin clinging to the ribs like leather. The preservation was remarkable for buried remains, a result of the soil chemistry, the particular composition of the earth. Dr. Walsh climbed into the trench himself, knelt beside the partially preserved corpse, and examined it in the fading afternoon light. He was looking for the cause of death, trauma, anything to explain this mass grave. What he found instead was a piece of cloth burlap still wrapped around the torso, and when he carefully moved the fabric aside, he saw that the rib cage had been opened, not by decomposition or scavengers, but deliberately, surgically. The sternum showed saw marks. The body had been processed. Walsh stood up too quickly, swayed, and had to grip the edge of the trench to steady himself. He'd been a physician for 26 years. He'd seen death in every form rural Pennsylvania could provide, but this was different. This spoke to intention, to the system, to something that his mind resisted categorizing. "Dr. Walsh!" One of the volunteers peered into the trench. "You all right?" Walsh didn't answer. He was staring at the soil beneath his boots, the rich, black, impossibly fertile soil. He was thinking about Silas Wickham's published letters on composting and organic supplementation. He was thinking about 40 bushels per acre when neighbors struggled to reach 25. He was understanding what kind of harvest the Wickhams had been reaping. "Stop digging," Walsh said, his voice hoarse. "Everyone out of the trenches." Now the volunteer looked confused. "Sir, get Sheriff Yost, get the county commissioners, and someone find Matthias Wickham and keep him where we can see him." "What's wrong? What did you find?" Dr. Walsh climbed out of the trench, stood in the field where wheat had grown from human remains, and felt the spring wind cold against his face despite the sweat on his neck. "Everything," he said. "We found everything." If this is giving you chills, you need to understand something important. We're only at the beginning of what Dr. Walsh uncovered in those fields. Hit that like button right now. Not because I'm asking, but because this story, this piece of American history that was deliberately sealed away for over a century, needs to be shared. The people who buried these records wanted them forgotten. Every share, every like, every comment is an act of resistance against that erasure. What we're about to explore in the next section is the physical evidence, the documents, the scope of an operation so systematic, so calculated, that it functioned for over 4 decades without detection. We're going to examine exactly what Silas Wickham did to those people, and why. This is your last chance to turn back if you're not ready for the full truth. For those of you brave enough to continue, for those of you who understand that real horror isn't supernatural, it's human, let's discover together what happens when the investigators force themselves to see what the soil had been trying to hide all along. The revelation is worse than you're imagining. The full excavation took 23 days and required the labor of 42 men working in rotating shifts. Dr. Walsh documented every phase in meticulous detail, creating a record that would later be sealed but never destroyed, preserved as evidence of what human beings are capable of when belief systems collapse into pure utility. By April 9, 1847, the count had reached 147 confirmed individuals. The burials extended across 23 acres in a grid pattern of remarkable precision. Each body occupied a plot measuring exactly 4 feet by 8 feet, arranged in rows running north-south, with 4 feet separating each grave. The grid was so exact that Walsh could predict where the next excavation would yield remains with near-perfect accuracy. This was not the work of madness. This was agriculture. The soil analysis, conducted by Walsh with assistance from a Philadelphia chemist named Dr. Robert Crane, revealed what Silas Wickham had actually been doing. The dark, rich earth in the northwestern fields was not naturally occurring. It had been engineered, created through a process that Silas had spent decades perfecting. The bodies had been treated before burial with compounds designed to accelerate decomposition and maximize nutrient release. Dr. Crane's analysis identified high concentrations of sulfates, which broke down proteins and soft tissue, phosphates concentrated in bone, released through acid treatment, nitrates, the key component of fertilizer, extracted from organic matter through bacterial decomposition, potassium compounds derived from wood ash, mixed into the burial soil, lime applied in controlled quantities to manage pH and prevent the soil from becoming too acidic. Each body had been placed in a shallow wooden frame, crude boxes constructed from rough-cut lumber that degraded along with the remains. The frames kept the bodies separated, prevented them from shifting, and allowed for uniform distribution of decomposition products into the surrounding soil. But the most damning evidence came from what Dr. Walsh found in the farmhouse. On April 12th, with Silas Wickham's reluctant permission and Sheriff Yost's legal authority, investigators searched the Wickham home. In Silas's study, a small room off the main kitchen that had been left untouched since his death in December 1846, they found his private journals. 43 volumes, spanning from 1804 to 1846, bound in plain leather, written in Silas's precise economical hand. The early volumes dealt with farming methodology, weather observations, crop yields, the ordinary record-keeping of a serious agriculturalist. But beginning in 1805, the entries changed. From Silas Wickham's journal, March 17, 1805, the composting experiment shows promise but insufficient scale. Animal matter provides nitrogen, but lacks the phosphate density required for sustained yield improvement. The wanderer who died of fever last week, Hutchins, I believe his name, gave me an idea of terrible clarity. Human remains contain everything the soil requires. The moral question troubles me, but if God creates man from dust, and to dust man returns, is it not simply the completion of a divine cycle? The man was godless, vagrant, without family or purpose. In death, he might serve a purpose he never achieved in life. I buried him in the northwestern corner, treated with sulfates and lime as I would any organic supplementation. The wheat above him will be the test. From April 29, 1805, the Hutchins plot shows 40% improved germination. The seedlings are darker green, more vigorous. I have proven the concept. The moral questions remain, but the agricultural results cannot be denied. From September 3, 1805, Hutchins' plot yielded 47 bushels per acre. The surrounding fields averaged 23. The margin is too significant to ignore. I need more plots, but the material cannot be obtained through waiting for natural death. The township is too healthy. I must consider other methods. The journals documented 41 years of systematic murder disguised as agricultural innovation. Silas Wickham had kept records with the same precision he applied to everything else: names, when he knew them, dates of death, burial locations, soil treatments applied, and subsequent crop yields from each plot. He had charts, comparison tables, graphs showing the correlation between body count and harvest productivity. He had sketched diagrams showing optimal spacing, burial depth, and treatment protocols. He had cost-benefit analyses, calculating the economic value of each murder in terms of increased wheat production. The journals revealed his methodology: victim selection. Silas targeted people who wouldn't be missed. Itinerant laborers, drifters, indentured servants fleeing contracts, failed farmers heading west, immigrants who spoke little English. He offered them work, shelter, and wages. Most stayed only weeks before Silas determined they were suitable, which meant isolated, friendless, and unlikely to be sought. Method of death: Silas preferred poison, specifically a tincture derived from water hemlock root, which induced paralysis and respiratory failure while leaving the victim conscious. He documented trying various methods: suffocation, throat cutting, blunt force trauma, but settled on hemlock because it was clean, produced minimal struggle, and did not damage the body in ways that complicated processing. The journal entry from June 12, 1809, described the death of a man Silas identified only as the German. Applied the hemlock tincture in his evening meal, full paralysis within 20 minutes. He understood what was happening, his eyes showed terror, but could not cry out or resist. Respiratory failure came at 43 minutes. I spoke to him throughout, explaining that his death served a greater purpose than his life ever had. Whether he took comfort in this, I cannot say. Buried him in row 3, plot 7, with standard sulfate treatment. No family to miss him, no employer seeking his return. He came from nothing and returned to nothing except the wheat. Processing: this was the detail that haunted Dr. Walsh most. Silas didn't simply bury his victims, he processed them. The surgical opening of the torso that Walsh had discovered was standard procedure. Silas would make an incision from sternum to pelvis, remove the internal organs, and bury them separately in scattered locations across the farm, what he called supplemental distribution. This prevented gas buildup that might disturb the burial, accelerated decomposition, and allowed him to extract the organs richest in nitrogen and phosphates. The journals contained clinical descriptions of this process, written with the detached precision of a medical text. Treatment protocol. After processing, Silas would place the body in its wooden frame, cover it with a mixture of sulfates, lime, and wood ash, then add 4 feet of soil. He would mark the location with a wooden stake that he removed after the first growing season. He planted wheat directly above each grave, rotating to other crops only after 3 full seasons of wheat harvest had exhausted the primary nutrient release. Victims. The journals contained names and descriptions, though many entries listed victims only by physical characteristics or origin. Dr. Walsh cross-referenced these entries with the skeletal remains, attempting to give names to the dead. Among the identified victims, James Hutchins, the first, 1805, a fever victim whose natural death inspired Silas's methodology. Samuel Worth, the drifter who'd fled in 1841 saying something was wrong about that place. Silas's journal from October 1841 notes, "The one who ran last month returned, drunk and desperate. Took him in again. He won't leave a second time." Worth's remains were identified by a distinctive dental pattern Walsh had noted in medical records when treating him for an abscess. Catherine Mills, one of only 14 female victims, 1823, a widow seeking work as a housekeeper. Silas noted, "Women are problematic. They generate more suspicion when they disappear. But this one is perfect. No family failed farm sold at auction, no destination beyond West. She told me herself no one would miss her. She was correct." J. Peterson, the laborer with the broken arm Walsh had treated in 1839. The skeletal remains matched Walsh's medical records perfectly, the malunion of the left radius at a 15-degree angle. Walsh had set that bone himself, sent the man back to work, and never seen him again. Now he knew why. 2 children, ages approximately 4 and 7, were buried together in 1818. Silas's journal identified them only as the orphans from Philadelphia, sent by the Church Placement Society for farm apprenticeship. His entry noted they were unsuitable for labor but suitable for the field. Small bodies, reduced yield, but no one from the city will travel here to inquire. This entry, more than any other, broke something in the investigation. Men who'd been working the excavation with grim determination wept openly when the children's remains were uncovered. 2 small skeletons, buried side by side, processed and fertilized into the earth with the same systematic efficiency Silas applied to adult victims. The timeline showed acceleration. In the first decade, 1805–1815, Silas had killed approximately 15 people, averaging 1.5 victims per year. In the second decade, 1815–1825, the number rose to 38 victims. In the third decade, 1825–1835, 52. The pattern suggested that, as Silas perfected his methods and saw the agricultural results, his moral resistance eroded and his ambition grew. The journals also revealed something investigators hadn't expected. Silas had tried to stop. Multiple entries from the 1830s documented his attempts to achieve the same yields using animal remains, advanced composting, and imported fertilizers. None matched the results of human supplementation. His entry from April 1834 read, "I am a monster. I know this. I pray for forgiveness I do not deserve and will not receive. I have tried every alternative, but nothing equals the yield, and I cannot go backward. The farm's reputation, the family's standing, Matthias's inheritance, all depend on maintaining production. The sin is already committed 100 times over. What difference do a few more make? I am damned regardless. At least the wheat is glorious. By the 1840s, the entries became shorter, more clinical, emptied of moral wrestling. They read like simple agricultural logs: date, victim, treatment, burial location, projected yield. The final entry was dated November 30th, 1846, 3 weeks before Silas's death. 89 years old. My hands shake too much for work now. Matthias knows nothing. I have ensured this. He will inherit the farm, the reputation, and the fields. The fields will continue to produce for years, perhaps decades, from what I have already planted. By the time the yields return to normal, I will be long dead, and Matthias will attribute it to soil exhaustion, as any farmer would. My secret dies with me. The Lord will judge me soon enough. I am ready for that judgment. I am not proud of what I've done, but I am not ashamed of the results. The farm will endure. That was always the purpose. Silas Wickham died in his sleep on December 22, 1846. 3 months later, the drought exposed his legacy. The physical evidence supported every word of the journals. The burial locations matched. The treatment methods matched. The number of victims matched the count from the excavations. Dr. Walsh's official report, submitted to the county commissioners on April 30th, 1847, concluded: Silas Wickham, deceased, was responsible for the murder of no fewer than 147 individuals between the years 1805 and 1846. The victims were selected for their social invisibility, killed through systematic poisoning, processed to maximize agricultural utility, and buried in grid patterns designed to optimize crop production. The northwestern fields of the Wickham farm are, in essence, a mass grave disguised as productive farmland. The wheat that brought prosperity to this family was literally grown from human remains. This represents the longest-running serial murder operation in American history. The systematic nature, the agricultural methodology, and the multi-decade timeline suggest a mind of exceptional intelligence applied to extraordinary evil. Silas Wickham transformed murder into farming and farming into murder. He erased the boundary between the two, creating a horrific symbiosis where human death became crop fertilizer and agricultural success became the motive for continued killing. The moral implications extend beyond one man's crimes. This community, myself included, benefited from those crimes. We purchased Wickham wheat. We praised his methods. We held him as an example of agricultural excellence. We were fed, literally, by the dead. The question now is what justice looks like when the perpetrator is already deceased and the crime scene is earth itself. The revelation of Silas Wickham's journals should have simplified the investigation. The perpetrator was dead. The evidence was overwhelming. The case should have moved swiftly toward closure. Instead, it metastasized into something far more complex. The first complication was Matthias Wickham himself. Sheriff Yost arrested him on May 2, 1847, charging him as an accessory to murder. The legal theory was straightforward. Matthias had operated the farm for years, had worked those fields, and had benefited from their exceptional yields. Surely he must have known. Matthias maintained absolute denial. "My father worked those fields himself," he repeated in every interrogation. He said the soil was experimental, temperamental, and required his specific knowledge. I honored his wishes. I never questioned it. Why would I? He was the finest farmer in Pennsylvania. Dr. Walsh attended the interrogations, watching Matthias carefully for signs of deception. What he saw troubled him. Not guilt, but genuine bewilderment. Matthias seemed authentically shattered by the discovery. He'd lost weight. I wasn't sleeping. His hands trembled when he spoke about his father. "Either he's innocent," Walsh told County Prosecutor Edmund Blackwell, "or he's the finest actor I've ever witnessed." "Or he didn't want to know," Blackwell replied. "Willful ignorance is still complicity." The prosecutor's case rested on a simple question: how could Matthias not have known? But as the investigation deepened, that question became more complicated. The farm's records, meticulously kept by both Silas and Matthias, showed a clear division of labor. Silas had maintained exclusive control of the northwestern fields from 1805 until his death. He did the plowing, planting, and harvesting himself or with select workers who, the journals revealed, were often victims scheduled for elimination. Matthias had managed the rest of the farm: the barns, livestock, southern fields, equipment maintenance, and sales. "My father said it was his retirement project," Matthias explained. "He'd worked his whole life building the farm. He wanted one section that was purely his to experiment with. That seemed reasonable. That seemed fatherly." Investigators found evidence supporting this division. Workers testified that Silas had been territorial about the northwestern section, had dismissed offers of help, had even grown angry when people approached without permission. One former farmhand, now working in Lancaster, recalled, "Old Mr. Wickham caught me walking through those fields as a shortcut in 42. Nearly fired me on the spot. Said I'd contaminated his soil with my boots, disrupted some process. I thought he was just peculiar about his methods. Farmers get like that." The legal proceedings against Matthias stalled. Without evidence that he'd participated in or had knowledge of the murders, the prosecution's case weakened. In July 1847, the charges were reduced to improper disposal of human remains, a misdemeanor based on the theory that even if Matthias hadn't known about the murders, he should have investigated when the bodies were discovered. But by then, the investigation had uncovered something more troubling. Silas Wickham hadn't been as isolated in his methodology as initially believed. On June 3, 1847, while cataloging Silas's correspondence, Dr. Walsh found a letter from a farmer in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, dated September 1829. The letter writer, identified as E.T., wrote, "Your letter in the American Farmer regarding organic supplementation intrigued me greatly. I would be most interested in discussing your methods in greater detail, particularly the source of your phosphate-rich compounds. I have access to similar materials and wonder if your success might be replicated. Discretion, of course, is essential. Perhaps we might correspond privately on these matters." Walsh found Silas's draft reply in the same folder. "I appreciate your interest, but I fear my methods are too particular to my specific soil conditions to be broadly applicable. Furthermore, the source of materials is extremely limited and cannot be shared. I wish you success in your own endeavors, but must decline further discussion of this matter." The exchange suggested that someone else had understood Silas's veiled references, had perhaps been engaged in similar activities. E.T. from Bucks County had been seeking advice on using human remains as fertilizer. Walsh immediately contacted authorities in Bucks County. Sheriff Yost dispatched letters to law enforcement across southeastern Pennsylvania, asking them to investigate any farms with unusually high yields and reputations for experimental agricultural methods. The responses came slowly throughout the summer of 1847. Most reported nothing unusual. 2 reported suspicious circumstances but insufficient evidence. 1 from Chester County reported findings that made Dr. Walsh's hands shake when he read the telegram. A farm belonging to the estate of recently deceased Elijah Turner had shown similar soil anomalies in fields being surveyed for sale. Elijah Turner. E.T. preliminary excavations had uncovered 23 bodies buried in a grid pattern nearly identical to the Wickham farm. This revelation transformed the investigation from a single horror into a potential network. Had Silas and Elijah corresponded beyond those 2 letters? Had they shared methodology? Were there others? A search of Silas's journals revealed 3 more references to E.T., all vague, all declining to share specific details, but acknowledging mutual understanding of certain agricultural realities. Silas had been careful, suspicious, perhaps, that his correspondent might be attempting to gather evidence against him. But the Elijah Turner farm proved that Silas's methodology wasn't unique. It had occurred to at least one other person independently, or perhaps through inference from Silas's published agricultural writings. The investigation faced its first organized resistance in mid-June, when prominent Lancaster County families began to understand the economic implications of the scandal. The Wickham wheat had been purchased by mills throughout the region. Those mills had processed it into flour. That flour had been sold to bakeries, shipped to Philadelphia markets, and exported to Europe. The Wickham name had been a mark of quality. Merchants had built businesses on the reliability of that brand. Now, those merchants faced ruin. Who would purchase flour known to be blood wheat? Who would buy bread from mills that had processed grain grown from corpses? A delegation of businessmen met with County Prosecutor Blackwell on June 19th. The meeting was private, but Walsh heard about it through a clerk who'd been present. The businessmen's position was simple. The full details of the case should be sealed. Silas was dead. Punishing him was impossible. Publicizing the specifics would only damage innocent merchants and farmers whose only crime was doing business with a respected neighbor. Think of the markets, one merchant reportedly argued. Lancaster County wheat feeds Pennsylvania. If word spreads that our most successful farm was fertilized with human remains, it damages every farmer in the region, guilty or innocent. Blackwell, to his credit, refused to suppress the investigation, but he agreed to limit public disclosure of the most disturbing details: the journals, the processing methods, the specific victim descriptions. The official record would acknowledge the murders, but not dwell on the methodology. This decision would shape how the story was remembered, or rather, forgotten. The resistance escalated in early July. Dr. Walsh received the first threat on July 4th. A note slipped under his office door. "Doctor, you've uncovered the evil. That's enough. Some truths serve no purpose beyond destruction. Men with families depend on this county's reputation. Drop this investigation or your family will suffer the consequences." Walsh reported the threat to Sheriff Yost, who increased patrols near Walsh's home, but acknowledged he had no way to identify the sender. "Half the county has motivation to want this buried," Yost said. "Business owners, farmers who competed with Wickham, families who don't want their town known for this horror. Could be anyone." A week later, someone set fire to Walsh's barn. The building was empty except for stored hay, and the fire was extinguished before spreading, but the message was clear. Thomas Brenneman, the merchant who'd helped with the initial excavation, began receiving threats as well. Customers stopped patronizing his store. Someone painted "liar" across his shop front in the middle of the night. The pressure intensified when a Philadelphia newspaper got hold of the story. On July 20th, 1847, the Philadelphia Public Ledger ran a front-page story: "Murder Farm Discovered in Lancaster County. Respected Quaker Farmer Killed Hundreds, Used Bodies as Fertilizer." The story was sensationalized, inaccurate in its details, claiming hundreds when the count was 147, but it accomplished what local officials had feared. It made the horror public and linked it indelibly to Lancaster County agriculture. The economic backlash was immediate. Philadelphia merchants canceled contracts with Lancaster County mills. Wheat prices dropped by 30% in a single week. Farmers who'd never met Silas Wickham found themselves unable to sell their harvests because buyers feared contamination. A group of Lancaster farmers, men who'd lost their livelihoods through association with Wickham's crimes, gathered at the county courthouse on August 1st, demanding that officials stop making this worse. One farmer, Samuel Dietrich, shouted at Prosecutor Blackwell on the courthouse steps, "Silas Wickham is dead. You can't prosecute a corpse. All you're doing is punishing us for his sins." The crowd numbered nearly 200. Sheriff Yost called in deputies from 3 neighboring counties to prevent a riot. Meanwhile, the investigation had uncovered evidence that the scope of Silas's crimes might extend beyond the 147 bodies found in the northwestern fields. Dr. Walsh's examination of the journals revealed references to supplemental distribution, the practice of burying extracted organs separately across the farm. In August, investigators began excavating other sections of the Wickham property, looking for these secondary burial sites. They found them in the apple orchard, the woodlot, and scattered through the southern fields. Pits containing decomposed organic matter that chemical analysis identified as human tissue. Not complete bodies, just organs buried individually or in small clusters, allowed to decompose and fertilize specific high-value crops. The orchard, which produced apples praised throughout the region for their unusual size and sweetness, had been fertilized with human hearts, livers, and kidneys buried among the root systems. This discovery added an estimated 30 to 40 additional victims whose remains were too degraded or scattered to be included in the official count. The true number of Silas Wickham's victims was likely between 170 and 190 people. But the most disturbing discovery came in late August, when investigators found a locked trunk in the cellar beneath the farmhouse. The trunk contained correspondence between Silas and 12 other individuals across Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. Not all the letters were explicit, but several strongly suggested that Silas had been part of a loose network of farmers experimenting with what one letter called alternative organic enrichment methods. A letter from J.M. in New York, dated 1831, read, "Your caution is understandable, but I believe we might benefit from more open exchange. I have been practicing methods similar to what I infer from your writings for 6 years now, with remarkable success. The moral burden is heavy, but the agricultural results justify the cost. We are feeding cities. We are advancing American prosperity. History will judge us by our contributions, not our methods." Most letters showed Silas deflecting these overtures, maintaining his isolation. But the correspondence proved that others had reached similar conclusions about the agricultural utility of human remains. Whether they'd acted on those conclusions was unknown. Dr. Walsh compiled a list of names and locations from the correspondence and forwarded it to law enforcement in the relevant jurisdictions. By September 1847, investigations had been opened at farms in 4 states. Only the Lancaster County case, Elijah Turner, produced confirmed evidence of similar crimes. The other investigations found suspicious circumstances but insufficient proof, or discovered that the letter writers had died years earlier, making prosecution impossible. The network, if it could be called that, seemed less organized conspiracy than parallel evolution, multiple individuals independently reaching the same horrific conclusion about maximizing agricultural yields. What unified them was their reading of agricultural literature, their knowledge of soil chemistry, and their willingness to view human life through a utilitarian lens. Silas hadn't invented this methodology. He'd simply perfected it and sustained it longer than anyone else. By September 1847, the investigation had uncovered 147 confirmed victims in the northwestern fields, an estimated 30–40 additional victims, whose remains were scattered evidence of at least one other farmer, Elijah Turner. Engaged in identical practices, correspondence, suggesting 8–10 additional individuals had considered or attempted similar methods, a systematic pattern of murder spanning 41 years' economic damage to Lancaster County agriculture, exceeding $300,000, canceled contracts and devalued property, and yet, no one living had been successfully prosecuted for murder. Silas Wickham remained in custody on reduced charges. The threats against investigators continued. The county struggled to balance justice against economic survival. And beneath it all was a terrible question that Dr. Walsh wrote in his private journal on September 15, 1847. How many other farms across America are built on similar foundations? How many other, successful, farmers have discovered that human bodies provide excellent fertilizer? We found this horror only because of a drought, because nature itself exposed what we refuse to see. How much remains hidden beneath the fields that continue to produce their abundant, blood-fed harvests? The investigation had deepened from a single farm's horror to a glimpse of something larger, a darkness embedded in the American agricultural system itself, enabled by the disposability of certain lives and the willingness to value productivity over humanity. And as Walsh would discover, the reckoning would be far from simple. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, just when we believed the horror was contained to one farm, one family, one monster, the investigation revealed something worse. The possibility that this wasn't isolated. Across American farmland, others had discovered the same terrible mathematics of human fertilizer. If you're still watching this, you're among the few willing to confront these truths. Share this video. Not for the algorithm, not for the views, but because these stories were deliberately buried. The official records were sealed. The economic powers of 1847 wanted this forgotten. They succeeded for over a century. You are part of breaking that silence. Our true crime family has grown to include thousands of seekers who understand that the most important histories are the ones that make us uncomfortable. Drop a comment right now. What do you think happened to the other farms mentioned in those letters? Were they investigated thoroughly, or did economic pressure bury those cases too? Because what comes next in our story is exactly that question. What does justice look like when the guilty are dead, when the living claim ignorance, and when an entire economy depends on forgetting? The reckoning is coming, and it's messier than you expect. The trial of Silas Wickham began on October 14, 1847, in the Lancaster County courthouse. The proceedings lasted 11 days and drew observers from as far as New York and Baltimore. Newspapers sent correspondents. The courtroom was packed daily with farmers, merchants, curiosity seekers, and families of the few identified victims. Prosecutor Edmund Blackwell faced an almost impossible task. The primary perpetrator was dead and beyond legal reach. The defendant claimed ignorance. The evidence overwhelming regarding Silas's guilt was circumstantial regarding Matthias's knowledge. Blackwell's case rested on three arguments. First, that Matthias had worked the farm for decades and must have observed irregularities. The exclusive access to certain fields, the unusual soil quality, the systematic disappearance of workers. Second, that Matthias had benefited financially from his father's crimes through inheritance and agricultural success, making him complicit even if passively so. Third, that willful ignorance in the face of obvious warning signs constituted criminal negligence. The defense, led by attorney Henry Carpenter of Philadelphia, dismantled these arguments methodically. Carpenter called witnesses who testified to the clear division of labor on the farm. Former workers described how Silas had been territorial and secretive about the northwestern fields, how he discouraged even family members from interfering with his experiments. Matthias's own children testified that their grandfather had forbidden them from playing in that section of the property, claiming the soil treatments were dangerous to children. My client, Carpenter argued, was guilty of one thing only, respecting his father. He honored a parent's wishes regarding property that the parent had controlled for 40 years. This is not criminal. This is filial duty. As for financial benefit, Carpenter pointed out that the exceptional yields came exclusively from the 23 acres of northwestern fields, less than 9% of the farm's total acreage. The rest of the property performed at normal productivity levels. The defendant inherited a successful farm, Carpenter said, but that success was built on 200 acres of legitimate agriculture, not on his father's hidden crimes. The prosecution's weakest point was the lack of any evidence that Matthias had known about the murders. No journal entries mentioned him. No witnesses placed him at burial sites. No correspondence implicated him. Silas had been extraordinarily careful to insulate his family from knowledge of his activities. Dr. Walsh, called as an expert witness, testified for 3 hours about the evidence. But under cross-examination, even he admitted, "I can find no direct proof that Silas Wickham knew about the murders." His shock appeared genuine. His cooperation with the investigation has been completed. If he knew, he concealed it perfectly. But I choose to believe that he did not know. That phrase, "I choose to believe," became the hinge upon which the trial turned. Even the lead investigator could not say with certainty that Matthias was guilty. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. They returned a verdict of not guilty on the murder-related charges. Guilty on improper disposal of human remains, a technicality based on Matthias's ownership of property containing unmarked graves, regardless of his knowledge of how they came to be there. The sentence: a fine of $500 and court costs. No prison time. The courtroom erupted. Families of identified victims screamed that justice had been denied. Supporters of Matthias wept with relief. Sheriff Yost required 20 minutes to restore order. Outside, the reaction was equally divided. Some saw the verdict as appropriate. Matthias was a victim of his father's evil, not a perpetrator. Others saw it as a betrayal. 147 people murdered, and no one living would face serious punishment. Dr. Walsh stood on the courthouse steps as Silas Wickham walked free and felt the full weight of unsatisfying reality. Justice, it turned out, was not always possible. Sometimes the guilty died before they could be held accountable. Sometimes the living were guilty only of not seeing what they should have seen. A crime of the soul, perhaps, but not one the law could adequately address. The fate of the Wickham farm became the next battleground. Matthias, though acquitted of murder, was ruined. His reputation was destroyed. His children were ostracized. No workers would accept employment on the property. The farm couldn't function. In November 1847, Matthias announced his intention to sell the property and move his family west to Ohio, where the Wickham name meant nothing and they might start over. But who would buy murder land? The property sat unsold for 8 months. Finally, in July 1848, a syndicate of Lancaster County businessmen purchased the farm for $3,200, a fraction of its pre-scandal value of over $15,000. The syndicate's stated purpose was to remediate the property and restore productive agriculture, to prevent economic waste. Their first action was to excavate every burial site in the northwestern fields, remove all human remains, and transport them to a mass grave at the edge of the township cemetery. The reburial took place on August 12, 1848, attended by Dr. Walsh, Sheriff Yost, 3 clergy members, and fewer than 20 townspeople. No individual markers were placed. The mass grave was marked with a simple stone that read, "Unknown dead, may God grant them peace." No mention of how they died, no reference to Silas Wickham, just an anonymous stone for anonymous bones. Of the 147 confirmed victims, only 23 were ever positively identified. The rest remained nameless: migrants, drifters, and forgotten people who disappeared into Pennsylvania soil and would remain unknown forever. There were no survivors. Every person Silas Wickham selected for his fields had died. Unlike some criminal operations that left traumatized witnesses, Wickham's methodology was absolute. The dead could not testify. But there were indirect survivors, family members who finally learned the fates of missing relatives. A woman in Philadelphia discovered that her brother, who'd gone west seeking farm work in 1837 and never written home, had likely died on the Wickham farm. A man in Baltimore learned that his missing son, a troubled young man who'd fled debt collectors in 1829, matched the description in one of Silas's journal entries. These families received no compensation, no formal apology, just confirmation that their missing loved ones were dead, had been murdered, and were now buried in an unmarked mass grave. The syndicate that purchased the farm hired laborers from outside Lancaster County, men who didn't know or care about the property's history, and put the land back into production. They avoided planting the northwestern fields for 3 years, allowing the soil to rest, then gradually returned them to wheat cultivation. By 1855, the Wickham farm was producing normal yields, 20 to 25 bushels per acre, and selling crops under the syndicate's corporate name with no reference to its previous ownership. The land had been laundered, rendered anonymous, allowed to forget. The broader legal ramifications were minimal. Pennsylvania passed no new laws in response to the Wickham case. No agricultural oversight regulations were created. No requirements for investigating missing farm workers were established. The other farms mentioned in Silas's correspondence were investigated with varying degrees of thoroughness. The Chester County case, Elijah Turner, resulted in excavations that confirmed 23 murders using identical methodology. But Turner was dead. His children, like Silas Wickham, claimed ignorance and were never charged. The property was sold, the bodies reburied, and the case closed. The farms in New York, New Jersey, and Maryland were investigated less aggressively. Economic pressure from agricultural interests, combined with the difficulty of prosecuting crimes when the alleged perpetrators were deceased, led to perfunctory examinations that produced no definitive evidence. Whether this represented genuine absence of wrongdoing or deliberate avoidance of uncomfortable truths remained unclear. By 1850, the wave of investigations had ended. No living person was in prison for the murder farm crimes. The economic disruption to Lancaster County agriculture had been contained. Wheat prices recovered. The scandal faded from newspaper coverage. The county records, Dr. Walsh's detailed investigative reports, the excavation logs, the transcripts of Silas Wickham's trial, and most significantly, Silas Wickham's 43 journals, were sealed by court order on March 3, 1851. The official justification was protecting the dignity of victims and their families. The practical effect was to bury the most disturbing details where future generations wouldn't easily find them. The sealed records were transferred to the basement archives of the Lancaster County courthouse, with instructions that they were not to be opened without specific judicial authorization. They sat in those archives for 112 years, gathering dust, slowly being forgotten. Dr. Ephraim Walsh continued his medical practice until his death in 1869. His private journals, discovered by his granddaughter in 1963, revealed that he never stopped thinking about the Wickham case. He wrote dozens of entries questioning whether he'd done enough, whether justice had been served, whether the truth had been adequately confronted or merely contained. His final entry about the case, dated April 1868, read, "21 years since we uncovered Silas Wickham's fields. I am an old man now, and I understand things I didn't understand then. We wanted justice, but justice was impossible. The guilty were dead or unprovable. We wanted accountability, but accountability would have destroyed innocent merchants and farmers. We wanted truth, but truth was economically inconvenient. So we compromised. We acknowledged the horror just enough to say we hadn't ignored it, then buried it deep enough that it wouldn't interfere with commerce. Perhaps that's the best humanity can do. Perhaps I'm a fool for thinking we could have done better. But I remain haunted by those 147 souls, most unnamed, buried now in a mass grave that will be forgotten within a generation. They deserved more. They deserved everything. They got a stone that doesn't even name them." The unanswered questions lingered for those few who remembered. How many of Silas's workers who moved on had actually been murdered? The journals documented 147 confirmed victims, but referenced failures and unsuitable burials that suggested botched attempts or bodies disposed of differently. How many other farms across America had discovered the same methodology? The investigation found one confirmed case and several suspicious possibilities, but the network of correspondence suggested wider knowledge of human fertilizer applications. Why did Silas start? The journals claimed it began with a single fever victim in 1805, but the speed with which Silas moved from that death to deliberate murder suggested prior contemplation. Had something happened before 1804 that wasn't recorded? What happened to the farm workers who survived employment on the Wickham farm? Dozens of men had worked there over the decades and left alive. Did any of them suspect? Did any of them see something but convince themselves they'd misunderstood? And finally, did Matthias really not know? The question that had driven the trial remained unresolved. Had he genuinely been ignorant, or had he simply been smart enough never to ask questions about things that might complicate his inheritance? The reckoning, in the end, was incomplete. The dead remained mostly nameless. The living mostly escaped punishment. The economic interests that pressured for burial of the truth largely succeeded. The reforms that might have prevented similar crimes never materialized. Silas Wickham's fields continued to grow wheat, just not from corpses anymore, or at least not from fresh ones. The Wickham case reveals something fundamental about how societies process horror. We absorb only as much truth as we can afford. In 1847, Lancaster County stood at a crossroads. One path led toward complete transparency, publishing every detail of Silas Wickham's journals, excavating every suspicious farm in the correspondence network, establishing agricultural oversight to prevent similar crimes, creating systems to track and protect migrant workers. The other path led toward controlled forgetting, acknowledge the horror, prosecute what could be prosecuted, then seal the records and return to economic normalcy as quickly as possible. Lancaster County chose the second path, not because the people were evil, but because they were practical. Farms needed to operate. Families needed to eat, markets needed to stabilize. The dead couldn't be brought back, and destroying the living economy wouldn't honor them. This is the calculus that buries history. The dead have no economic power. The living do. What the Wickham case reveals about human nature is more disturbing than the murders themselves. Systematic evil can function for decades within a community if it's economically beneficial, and the victims are socially invisible. Silas Wickham didn't operate in secret because he was clever. He operated openly, hiring workers through normal channels, maintaining a public reputation, publishing his methods in agricultural journals. The secrecy wasn't in his actions, but in the community's willingness not to look too closely. People disappeared from the Wickham farm for 41 years, not occasionally, regularly. And the pattern was dismissed because the people who disappeared didn't matter enough to investigate. They were drifters, migrants, failed farmers, the economically superfluous. Their absence created no crisis, demanded no response, generated no systematic inquiry. This is the lesson that wasn't learned in 1847 and remains unlearned today. Certain lives are treated as disposable, and that disposability enables atrocity. Silas Wickham understood this instinctively. He selected victims based on their social invisibility. He knew that a missing day laborer would generate no investigation, while a missing merchant's son would bring sheriffs from 3 counties. The modern parallels exist in every system where some lives are valued more than others, where migrant workers disappear into agricultural operations and no one tracks them, where missing persons from marginalized communities receive a fraction of the investigative resources dedicated to others, where economic efficiency is prioritized over human dignity. The Wickham farm is not an anomaly. It's an extreme example of a persistent truth. Systems that render some people invisible will enable those who want to make them disappear. The story was hidden for 112 years not because the records were destroyed, but because no one was looking. The sealed documents sat in courthouse archives, available to anyone with judicial authorization to access them. But who seeks authorization to examine old agricultural crime records? Who thinks of investigating a forgotten scandal from the 1840s? The story resurfaced only because of an accident. A courthouse renovation in 1963 required moving archived materials, and a curious law clerk named Patricia Thornton noticed the unusual seal date and the single-word notation, "Resolved." She requested authorization to examine the files out of professional curiosity, discovered Dr. Walsh's reports and Silas Wickham's journals, and brought the case back into public awareness. Even then, the revelation generated minimal attention. A few historical journal articles, a brief mention in a book about Pennsylvania agricultural history, no major media coverage. The story had been buried too long and too completely to generate sustained interest. Until now. Until people like you decided that buried history deserves resurrection, that the unnamed dead deserve to be remembered, even if they can never be identified, that the uncomfortable truths are precisely the ones we most need to confront. The legacy of the Wickham farm is not in the fields themselves. Those acres are indistinguishable now from any other Pennsylvania farmland. The legacy is in the question the case forces us to ask. What else have we chosen not to see because seeing it would be inconvenient? How many other horrors are buried beneath normalcy, waiting for drought or accident or someone's stubborn curiosity to expose them? So here's the question I want you to consider. Do you believe Matthias Wickham truly didn't know what his father had been doing for 41 years? Think about it carefully. Think about what it means to inherit prosperity built on hidden atrocity. Think about willful ignorance, about the questions we don't ask because we fear the answers might complicate our lives. Drop your thoughts in the comments. This isn't just history. It's a question about human nature that remains relevant every time we benefit from systems we choose not to examine too closely. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel needs. Subscribe now, because next week we're investigating another sealed case from the 1800s. The physician's collection, what they found behind the walls of St. Mary's Hospital. Another story buried for over a century. Another truth that powerful interests wanted forgotten. Thank you for having the courage to listen to this. Thank you for refusing to let these 147 souls, most of them nameless, all of them forgotten, remain buried in silence. The dead can't speak for themselves, but we can speak for them. Remember their story, share it, don't let it be buried again.